Welcome back to the Race Class Podcast. This is John Feingold. For one of our final episodes of the summer, I had the immense pleasure of speaking with two leading environmental law scholars, Rebecca Bratspies, who's now at Tulane University, and Carmen Gonzalez, who's at Loyola University, Chicago. They joined the Race Class Podcast to discuss a new teaching guide that they created for environmental law classes. I know I can be hyperbolic, though I don't think I'm being hyperbolic when I say that this teaching guide could not be more timely, in part because the guide exposes all of the ways in which race and racism are embedded within all the fights about environmental law around the country. And so often, environmental law classes fail to center how racial dynamics both shape the law and individuals and communities' ability to enjoy basic rights that they should have under the law. And this also came up in the conversation, but what I shared with Rebecca and Carmen is how excited I was to read the teaching guide, in part because it made me excited to get back into the classroom, even though I don't teach environmental law, because so many of the stories and the concepts and the ideas that they make so clear in this guide is applicable across the law school curriculum and certainly in undergrad classes as well. And the conversation also could not be more timely because we are in a moment of what I think others have rightly referred to as a polycrisis. There's multiple, somewhat existential crises that we're facing as a society, as a species, that includes ever escalating efforts to prevent students from being able to learn basic facts, ideas, and concepts that they need to make sense of their world. We're also in the midst of a climate emergency and a federal government that is trying to dismantle all of the guardrails that we have as a society in order to protect the environment, which we need to sustain ourselves and to live with the dignity that we all deserve. I hope you enjoy the conversation, and I hope you enjoy the last few weeks of summer. Welcome to the Race Class Podcast. This is John Feingold, and I'm here today with Rebecca Bratspies from Tulane University School of Law and Carmen Gonzalez from Loyola University Chicago School of Law to talk about really incredible teaching guide they made for teaching environmental law in law schools. Though, as I'm going to gesture to throughout the conversation, I don't teach environmental law, but I think I'm going to use the aspects of what you've created for some of the classes that I teach, including property law. We'll get into that. There's sort of a perfect, though ominous, I don't know if that's the right way to put it, day for speaking with both of you because I'm sitting in my office in Boston and it is apocalyptic outside. The sky is orange. You can't really tell what's going on because I think there are massive wildfires in Canada and northern Minnesota, and all of the smoke and all the particulate matter is now, hitting New England. And so this morning, when I walked my 7-year-old to camp, he was wearing a mask. Our neighbors were wearing a mask. The little air purifier inside our home was going off the charts. And we're going to, be talking about how you teach in this moment and to these things. So that's way too long of a wind up from me. So I want to start by thanking you both for being here. You have a sense of the sort of questions that I'm going to ask, but just to start, I'd love for you both just to briefly introduce yourself. And then I'll ask, the second introduction question. But yeah, just situate our listeners. And so I guess, Carmen, I'll go with you first, then to Rebecca.
Okay, so thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. My name is Carmen Gonzalez. I am the Morris I. Liebman Professor of Law at Loyola University Chicago School of Law. My scholarship focuses on international environmental law, human rights and the environment, environmental justice, and global food justice. In addition to my books and articles on environmental law, I am also the co-editor of two books on the experiences of women of color in academia. Presumed Incompetent, The Intersections of Race and Class for Women in Academia, which was published in 2012, and Presumed Incompetent 2, which was published in 2020. Thank you, Jonathan. You have the book. I'm very impressed.
You should just know that Jonathan is holding up the book that he just pulled off his bookshelf and knew exactly where it was.
Thanks, Carmen. It's so nice to be with you today. And Rebecca, I'll turn over to you.
My name's Rebecca Bratspies. I am the Oliver Houck Professor of Environmental Law at Tulane University. And until very recently, I taught at City University of New York, where I ran the Center for Urban Environmental Reform. My work focuses on environmental justice, the human right to a healthy environment, and the way that cities respond to environmental challenges. And I'm pretty sure you don't have my book about New York City called Naming Gotham, which is brings a lot of that environmental focus to a more mass audience through the lens of who do we name things after in New York City? Like all of our roads here have names, and the stories behind how we decided who to name things for and what things get named tells a lot, reveals a lot about the racial history of the city and the environmental history of the city.
So I don't have that book, though. I think I recall, Rebecca, seeing that you were also involved in creating a series of graphic novels.
Yes, I should have mentioned that as well. Probably that's what I'm best known for is as the comic book lady, making the Environmental Justice Chronicles, which is a series of 3 graphic novels that are used in schools across the country, actually, at levels from middle school, high school, college, and law school, to teach the principles of environmental justice and citizen science, community science to a new generation of environmental leaders and to help them see the role that environmental justice plays for framing environmental issues in a fashion that makes sure we're protecting people and protecting the most vulnerable as we try to improve the environment.
And I will say that it's inspiring and motivating to see the work that you've both done and just personally trying to figure out how to produce stuff that people actually read or engage and learn from. And so, like Presumed Incompetent, I got at a bookstore like a decade ago or something. And the graphic novels. My 7-year-old now, the thing that he's drawn to are little graphic novels, and so it's exciting to see more established scholars doing really interesting work in different ways. And so, yeah, excited to be with you today. So now let me turn to a slightly different question, or at least a question that's inflected slightly differently, which is one that I invite everyone to respond to who comes on the Race Class podcast. And the question is, where was your racial education? And it really is meant to be an open-ended invitation for you to share about when it was, where it was, how it was that you began thinking about these things that we call race and racism. And I guess I'll go in reverse order, back through to Rebecca and then to Carmen.
That's an interesting question. I really had fun thinking about it and sort of paring back in my mind. For me, I think it was Shirley Chisholm's 1972 run for president. I was very little, but my parents were very politically active. And so we had a lot of conversations about the election, about the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And I, as a very small girl, was all in for the woman in the race. And I mean, it didn't occur to me at the time that because she was a Black woman, maybe that would be a problem, because I think I was too little for that. But the reaction that I got when I piped up at every sort of meeting Shirley Chisholm, you should all vote for Shirley Chisholm. And people would look at, and like adults would make comments that my parents would then have to interpret for me and try to help me understand why there was this not only hostility, but disrespect for her that there was not for some of the other candidates. And, that was a really transformative moment for me. It was, like I said, it was very little, but I think that started me before I went, when I went to school, being attuned to these issues from a much earlier age than maybe a white kid growing up in the suburbs might otherwise have been.
Interesting. Thanks for sharing. Carmen.
My own experience as a racialized person caused me to think about race and racism very early on. I was born in Cuba and I came to the US as a child. I grew up in northern New Jersey in the shadows of New York City in a Latino immigrant community that Junot Diaz actually immortalized in his book, The Brief, Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, and in his short stories. So I feel vindicated. The place I came from is now out in literature. In the generation before mine, Irish and Italian immigrants were the dominant group. My racial education started in Catholic grammar school, which was a majority white environment when my parents enrolled me. The racism that I encountered there was blatant and in your face. It was not the more genteel racism of the elite. I later attended public grammar school, and public high school, and that was a completely different world. It was majority Latino, primarily Cuban, but of a wide range, and also solidly blue collar. Completely different world where I was accepted and respected and valued. History repeated itself when I attended Yale as an undergraduate and was again in a majority white institution, this time surrounded by extremely affluent students who had attended private prep schools and elite public high schools. It was my education at Yale, both in and outside the classroom, that gave me the tools to understand my own experience of racialization, but also racial hierarchies in the US and globally. One book that was particularly transformative for me was this bridge called My Back, Writings by Radical Women of Color, which is an anthology of poetry, essays, personal narratives, and interviews edited by Sherry Moraga and Gloria Ansaldúa. The book introduced me to the idea of intersectionality long before Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term and further theorized and developed the concept. And in many ways, this bridge, presumed incompetent, harkens back to this bridge called My Back. It's the same idea of narratives that shed light on the concept of intersectionality. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that Audre Lorde, Black feminist poet, was also profoundly influential and inspirational. And I had the pleasure of not only reading her work, but seeing her, meeting her when she spoke at Yale when I was an undergraduate.
Oh, thanks so much. And as you're both speaking, and especially, or in particular, Carmen, we were talking about the writing and the scholarship that you were exposed to. Yeah, I cannot help but, think, in part because this is where my head and my own sort of scholarship and work right now is situated, in this sort of the just, nationwide effort to purge from, K through 12 schools and from universities, opportunities to learn these things, to simply be exposed to and engage these sorts of texts with a very, like, sort of explicit targeting of gender studies departments, of ethnic studies departments, of Black studies, in part so that, students just lose the opportunity to be exposed to ideas that, among other things, just, help you realize that, the way the world isn't natural, or the way that it has to be. And so I really appreciate you both sharing that. I think I'll pivot us to the teaching guide that you wrote and that you shared with me prior to the conversation, called Teaching Environmental Law in Context. I mentioned some of this before I hit record, and I should say it again. it's such an as someone who is a law professor who does not teach environmental law, but cares about this stuff, but also, as I said, is, in this moment feeling cynical in different sorts of ways. It was exciting to look through it and to read it, in part because it activated some just excitement in me to be in a classroom where students are exposed to the ideas, but also to have a resource that professors at the front of the room can rely on, given that, for all sorts of reasons, it's harder than one might think to, do the bare minimum when it comes to exposing students to sort of this well-rounded set of ideas. So I guess I just love to start, and I'll invite you, one of you or both of you, to maybe give us the little bit of the backstory. What motivated you to write this? Is there a sort of a genesis story that, we should know?
I'll start. There is. So I think that I can speak for myself and Rebecca here, and that we have both been frustrated by the ways that the leading environmental law textbooks marginalize racial and economic justice. And we've both done what we can to supplement, to add to the curriculum. And then, and for a long time, we've had conversations. Should we do our own textbook? But then we thought, no, people are so wedded to their textbooks, they won't switch. But then a couple of things came together. In 2024, John Knox at Wake Forest Law School, who had served as UN Special Rapporteur on the right to a healthy environment, published an article analyzing US environmental law through a human rights framework. And he concluded that the US, at the tail end of the Biden administration, largely, with some exceptions, largely complied with the substantive and procedural aspects of the right to a healthy environment, with one glaring exception. That exception was environmental racism and the failure to protect the rights of Indigenous peoples. Knox, if you know him, is extremely measured and careful in his language. He described the situation as catastrophic. You would never know this if you looked at one of the leading environmental law textbooks. You would never have an idea that this was the largest failing of US environmental law, because environmental justice, if it's covered at all, is often one chapter that no one has time to cover because this course is already so overloaded. Well, Rebecca and I were invited to contribute to an online symposium, a series of blogs on this very article that John Knox wrote. And we decided to consider the implications of his article for legal pedagogy. So in other words, the way that we teach environmental law has implications for who winds up going into the field, how they practice when they get there, and which groups do and do not receive environmental protection. So in a blog titled The Unbearable Whiteness of Environmental Law, we discussed the ways that traditional environmental law textbooks relegate environmental justice to the margins of the curriculum. And we made very concrete suggestions about things that faculty can do to interrogate the stark racial disparities in environmental protection. The book is in many ways a direct outgrowth of the essay. Instead of telling colleagues what they should do, the book shows faculty how they can seamlessly integrate environmental justice into every topic covered in the foundational environmental law course. And we also provide teaching tips, teaching exercises, videos, case studies, and problems that faculty can use.
Thank you. Rebecca, anything you want to layer on?
Yeah, I just want to add a little bit. The number of times that someone has said to me, very well meaning, I'm going to take it as sort of on face value, but the number of times someone has said to me, I would love to cover environmental justice in my environmental class, or I would love to cover structural racism I probably don't say it quite like that, in my property class, but I don't know how. And so, this book is the answer to that. I feel like we can hand it to people and say, here, this is how to do it. If you really would love to put the people who are the most vulnerable at the center of how you think about and talk about and teach about environmental law and property law, we've given you a roadmap for doing that. We have broken it down based on each statute, we've gone like for each statute that you typically cover in environmental law. And for those of you who don't know, there are 14 major statutes in environmental law, and most classes are statute a week, and statute a week, and it's just sort of very technocratic, very big picture, and it's all about what the Court of Appeals is doing in any particular situation, rather than how agencies are interpreting law in the interface between communities, business activity, and government, and what that means for who gets to breathe clean air, who gets to drink water that isn't going to poison them, and who lives on land that isn't toxic. And we went through each of the statutes and we brought that back in. Why do we have these statutes? We have these statutes because the air was poisoned, the water was poisoned, the land was being poisoned. And then we talk about like the places where that succeeded, those laws succeeded, the problems that the laws actually made a difference on. It's very ironic, as you said, that today we are talking in a day where in Duluth, right, the air quality in the United States is the worst in Duluth today. It is hazardous. It is maroon on the EPA's air quality index. Hazardous air, the guidance is don't go outside, which is oh so helpful, right? Some people actually have the luxury that they cannot go outside, but a lot of people work outside. A lot of people need to go outside for a lot of reasons, and they can't hold their breath because we all need to breathe. Most people breathe about 20 times a minute. When you're breathing in polluted air, you're breathing in toxins. You're breathing in things that harm your health. And without sort of that rooting for, it doesn't matter how complicated a scheme there is for assessing emissions limitations in in whatever factory or whatever tailpipe, if you don't start with the fact that when people breathe in air that is polluted, it makes them sick, it can kill them, it causes all kinds of diseases, then you're missing the impetus behind this law. And students in the classroom, when they don't have the connection to why all this technical stuff matters, it's very easy to just view environmental law as a really complicated technical thing, as opposed to about protecting people and the places that people live, and the wider non-human world as well.
Yeah, and just as you're talking, one of the things that I'm thinking about is simply as a matter of engaging students. Students are far more likely to engage, to sink their teeth into, to just sort of emotionally sort of resonate with the stories of how, manufacturing, for example, poisons people. And to think about, oh, and then you have some intervention, which is, a law. And, how is the law designed in order to, protect people from being poisoned, and sort of situating it in this, just the real life stakes. It's hard to see how that would just not create a more conducive environment for learning, because students are just going to be, I think, just more intuitively engaged. So I was gonna hold this, and maybe I'll just sort of put it out there, and you can either respond to it now, or it can just drift, and I can go to another thing. We can circle back. But a question that I've been thinking about for a while is, so when you have, whatever the course is, whatever the subject matter is, whether it's environmental law, whether it's property law, whether it's Fourth Amendment law, sort of unreasonable search and seizure, and you teach it in a way that sort of obscures or omits or just does not name the sort of the racial implications, for example, or the gender dimensions of it. Is that incomplete education where there's just a gap, or is it actually a form of miseducation? And so maybe I'll just I'll put that out there as just a question that I'm grappling with, because I think it because then the answer to that then sort of means different, that then there's a different takeaway from the teaching guide that you're writing, which is either it's about filling gaps or it's actually about sort of reducing the degree to which we, so like myself included, well-intentioned teachers are constantly engaging in different sorts of forms of miseducation, because students cannot actually understand the subject matter in a non-distorted way unless they understand sort of this broader context. And so, yeah, maybe I'll just ask us to go there if you have any. So, is the intervention, the teaching guide, is it just filling gaps? And I guess by just, I don't mean to in any way diminish it. Or is it something more about qualitatively correcting what we're doing in the classroom, not because of bad intentions, but because there is this path dependency, because you get a case book, it does something that came from somewhere. And so yeah, I've thrown a bunch of stuff at the wall. I'm going to step back and invite you both to jump in.
Do you mind if
Go
I
ahead,
go
Rebecca.
first this time? Okay, so I think you've raised something really, really important. And we are as miseducated as our students in many cases. I mean, the number, just in talking about this book and in sharing bits of it with people, the number of people that have responded by saying, "Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know that's how that got there." I teach administrative law sometimes, and so there's a whole series of cases about the line between when somebody's entitled to due process and when they're not. And omitted from that line of cases is the fact that they were rooted in the struggle for racial justice. The Roth case, which is one of the cases about when does somebody have a property right sufficient to trigger a right of due process, right? It was a guy who was fired. And if anybody talks about why he was fired from his job teaching, they typically say it was something about the Vietnam War. It wasn't. It was because he supported scores of Black students who were suspended for protesting. The Gosby Lopez case, right? Nominally, it's about, does a student have a right to a hearing before they're suspended? And what's left out of that is the fact that the students were suspended for celebrating and recognizing Black History Day. And, without that context, it's hard to understand what's happening. And, one of the things we tried to do in this book is to put that context that exists for all the things we're talking about back into it. In terms of, just an example, back to the Clean Air Act, since the air is so bad today. Right. One of the things that we talk about in that chapter is the Denora death smog of 1948. Right. Scores of people were sickened or killed because of a weather inversion that kept all kinds of pollution in the town of Denora, Pennsylvania. And at the time, they did research and showed that the Black residents of the town were far more likely to be impacted than the white residents. And, talking about it in the 1940s maybe gets us a little bit out of the political polarization of today, because you can show them the headlines from the 1940s. You can show them the research from the 1940s showing that this terrible event that impacted the town horribly had a disparate impact on those who were most marginalized and most excluded. And everywhere you look, that's true. So if we don't help our students know that they need to look and then show them how to look, they're not understanding the problems that law is engaging with, and whatever solutions they come up with are not going to be really meeting the moment of the problem.
And I think it gets worse. When we don't provide the historical context, we are actually discouraging students who have a passion for social justice and came to our course for that reason. And then what do most faculty do? We bury them in unintelligible statutory provisions, mind-numbing acronyms. I think environmental law may take the prize for that. And these appellate and Supreme Court decisions that seem to be untethered from reality, much less connected to anything that matters. And students know that there are huge racial disparities in environmental protection. And they want to know why. But most textbooks don't give them the answer to that why. They just suggest that this is an irrelevant question. The other thing that I found is that giving students not only the history, but concrete contemporary examples really engages them instead of putting them to sleep. Environmental law can be really boring. It can be abstract. It can be technocratic. It's really easy to lose sight of the life and death consequences of seemingly technical decisions. But if you include concrete case struggles, the Dakota Access Pipeline, the Flint water crisis, the Detroit water shutoffs, industrial hog farms in North Carolina, the bombing and inadequate cleanup of Vieques, Puerto Rico, petrochemical pollution in the Houston Ship Canal, just to cite a couple, suddenly it comes alive. And this isn't even an add-on, it is a tool that students can use to actually do the difficult analytical work that environmental law requires. So we're simultaneously teaching history, legal doctrine, and practice-based skills. And that really inspires students and engages them. So I would say we are miseducating them in general, and we're doing a paradigm shift. This is a different way of bringing history and contemporary struggles into the classroom in a way that enhances the learning experience for all students.
Yeah, and it's taking the gaze away from the appellate court and putting it on the people who make the day-to-day decisions that build the built environment, right? That decide what the permit terms are going to be, that decide where things can be located. And those are the places where students, first of all, may we be working. And second of all, where they can actually see how they can make a difference. Because, you can really see what the difference is between a 7 parts per million standard and a 15 parts per million standard when you look at a particular permit in a particular place with a particular water body or a particular airshed. And you can also see how people advocating for a more stringent standard have won and made a difference, and how that can sort of change the trajectory of people's lives.
And this is important, if I can interrupt, because we need to give our students hope. These are really difficult times, and it's easy to sink into despair. So one of the things that we do in our book is we highlight the areas where progress is being made. And students find that inspiring. So one example is the right to a healthy environment under state constitutional law, and major cases in Montana, right, if you could believe it, right, a red state, Hawaii, and elsewhere that have really shifted the conversation and recognized the right to a healthy climate as a human right. In the Flint, Michigan case, the Michigan Supreme Court has recognized the right to bodily integrity, and that people in Flint who were denied that right have a cause of action. These are huge victories, but more importantly, students can then envision themselves doing this kind of work.
So, and I think there's something, and I guess I'm curious whether this is another aspect of the teaching guide that's intentional, because so the hog farming example, and this was something that I wanted to talk about because, and I think the first chapter, you describe how in North Carolina, there was this string of incredible litigation victories. And you can fill in the details, but I'll just read from the text. A coalition of Black North Carolinians successfully used nuisance litigation, which essentially for our listeners means nuisance. It's a private lawsuit that someone like I could bring if my neighbor is doing something on their yard that undermines my ability to use my yard in the way that I want to. But so in this case, you had Black communities that successfully brought a nuisance claim against Smithfield, this global hog producer conglomerate that resulted in millions of dollars of damages based on what was probably horrific stench and pollution from the hog farming. But then what the teaching guide goes on to share is that was not the end of the story, because then the North Carolina legislature exempts hog farming from nuisance law as a way to sort of prevent communities from being able to enjoy the law to protect quote unquote property rights, which, I thought we held sacred in this country, though in this instance, it's a nice way of, showing how through law we get to determine who has rights that are enforceable. But So in a sense, that's a circuitous way of me getting to something that I was thinking about as I reading the section, but sort of that, one page is a really nice opportunity to also sort of resist the pull within, I think, sort of standard law teaching to focus on argumentation and persuasion in the context of litigation as the coin of the realm, the skill that if you learn it, you will be the top lawyer because in a sense, or I guess this is my takeaway, and then I'd love for either of you to sort of share about this example or sort of more. Like to me, this is a story about how a lawyer, a future lawyer, at best, you are a problem solver who has some skills that maybe other folks don't skills that you are going to bring to scenarios in which, either you enjoy some power imbalance if you work for, a large corporate entity, or if you're representing, this coalition of Black North Carolinians, there's a power imbalance. And so you gotta understand, both the potential, but also the limits of argumentation in the context of litigation. And then for me, and then I'll pause. I want to bring you in. This is also an example that really flags why this teaching guide, even though it's called Teaching Environmental Law, I think it could be, would be valuable in a whole set of courses, whether that's voting rights law. Because I'm thinking about, Memphis, in which you have data centers that are getting pushed in against the will of the local population, which is an environmental racism, environmental justice problem, also connected to representation. And, obviously property law classes. And so, yeah, I'd love to hear sort of this example, if there's more that you want to share on it, and then, anything else about how, this, sort of transcends environmental law, and then, the other ways in which we, unmindfully constrain how we teach in the classroom. That was
Start
like
this
the
one.
worst example of the compound question. So thank you for bearing with me.
Well, since you started with the hog farms, Rebecca, why don't you talk about the hog farms and then I'll continue with other parts of the question.
Okay. So, first of all, we come back to that example multiple times because the hog farms create all kinds of environmental problems. And using that as an example is a way to help students understand that the law divides up environmental protection into the air and the water and waste. But that's not how we experience the world. And that the same activities create problems for the air, the water, and the land and generate massive amounts of waste. And so if we want to change things, we need to think about that integrated nature of problems. The hog farm situation is to me one of the most staggering overt examples of the way that environmental racism shapes practices. If you look at them, there was a wonderful scientist named Steve Wynn who died tragically young, who did a lot of the work documenting the impact that the hog farms had. And he did it with community members, and they were co-authors of the publications. And it was a model for the kind of research that is constructive rather than extractive, and that builds community capacity and knowledge as an intentional part of doing academic research. And I think that's an important thing to model and point out for students. But it also really is a way to direct them out of the idea of lawyer as savior. I will come in and litigate for you and solve your problem. In fact, I know what your problem is, and I will tell you what your problem is, and then I will solve it. To a much more nuanced and sophisticated recognition that the problem of where these hog farms are sited is part of a problem of voting rights exclusion, which is part of a problem of how the criminal justice system is enforced, which is also part of a problem of how bank loans are made for housing. And all of these factors together create the situation where you have a community that can find itself at the mercy of these hog farms. And quite frankly, the farmers running these hog farms are, not making out like bandits. It's the Smithfields of the world that are extracting the profits from this, and they are leaving the farmers and their neighbors with environmental devastation. And, another thing that I think that this example adds throughout the curriculum, and it's really a very helpful example to return to when you talk about how the Clean Water Act is or is not enforced, how the Clean Air Act is or is not enforced, how RCRA is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which governs the management of waste, is or is not enforced, and why hog waste has been classified as a fertilizer that allows it to just be sprayed on fields. And people live next door to those fields. Their houses are sprayed with pig waste. But it also brings the state legislature back into the law school curriculum, which is pretty much absent. I mean, unless you're talking about constitutional law and somebody's challenging a state law, the state legislature is pretty much absent from the law school curriculum. And yet, the state legislature has tremendous power to either reinforce inequality or to try to remedy it. Carmen mentioned the human right to a healthy environment that multiple states have adopted into their constitution. That's a legislative process that then turns to the voters of the state. And if you have an awareness of the critical role that state legislatures and city governments also play in these decisions, right? That gives you both a new set of problems to engage with, but also a new set of legal tools that can potentially be in your toolbox for trying to respond to things.
And to build up on what both of you, I think, talked about in terms of the problem of white saviorism, we're going to tell you what your problem is and how to solve it. One of the things that our book also highlights is that law is just one tool in a much larger struggle for social justice. Some people have asked, why do you have a final chapter on international human rights law? It's not enforceable in US courts. Well, we have it because advocates in environmental justice cases have used the law, the discourse, and the institutions to enhance their work, to reframe popular discourse. We use as an example the Detroit water shutoffs, which was a massive political community mobilization, right, to fight it. And what they were chanting at the protests was fight, fight, water is a human right. And why would you do that when international human rights law is not directly enforceable? It's because of the political power that it wields in terms of how we think about the problem, how it reframes it in a way that speaks to people. So we do a lot of that. Getting back to your question about how this book could be used in other courses, one of the things that I've enjoyed doing is the deep history. Rebecca has just given you an example of the hog farms, but we do something very similar with the Dakota Access Pipeline. It's the history of settler colonialism in the United States. It's the injustices that began way back when, and it's one thing compounding after another after another. The Flint water crisis, well, you have to start with the great migration of African Americans, with redlining, with segregation, with voting rights, with municipal debt underinvestment, with white flight, insolvency, and then a manager that is appointed to essentially override any semblance of democracy. The city council wanted to shift away from the contaminated water. The emergency manager, whose job was to collect money, said no. And so the problem of democracy is also the problem of environmental injustice. And you could use those case studies in any course because of that deeper history that they bring to the table.
So as you were speaking, I was just sort of reflecting on how little we teach in law school. The amount of time that students are in class, but how little we teach, and how much time there is available to teach, but it does require context. Because if you just parachute students in, if we just parachute ourselves in, to some moment without understanding the political economy of a community, how this formed, what were, so connecting the Detroit water crisis to Great Migration because of Jim Crow and extreme violence in the South, and then Black communities entering the North, and then experiencing like a whole different kind of sort of extreme racism. It there is a degree to which it is a deep miseducation because sort of we ourselves and students sort of internalize sort of particular moments as the baseline and as the beginning, without understanding how that was created, which then makes it much harder for us, I think, to both see the injustice of it, but then how you escape it. But also for me is sort of this horrific, grotesque irony of all the the right wing attacks on teaching about race and racism that caricature schools as these places in which students are actually getting this deep, sort of rich, sort of comprehensive knowledge where all the interventions are just trying to bring in sort of little opportunities for students to, have a more comprehensive sense of why the world is the way it is. So I get one sort of just question that's sort of a curiosity question is I'd love to hear how the broader environmental law sort of academic community has responded to this teaching guide, but then also the piece that you wrote on sort of environmental law's whiteness problem, if that was how I said. And I'm thinking in part of a colleague of mine, wonderful colleague, Steve Dean, who's a tax law professor, who has made sort of parallel interventions in the tax law space and has, complicated stories about how different folks within tax law have responded. And so I'm curious, in part because I think environmental law is coded as sort of more left, certainly than tax law is, what the response has been. Not that it's a singular monolithic one.
So we have had the great privilege of presenting about this book multiple times in the past months. The book just came out, so there aren't a lot of reactions yet, but we have presented it at 4 or 5 conferences at this point, and people are excited because we're in a moment where environmental law is being dismantled in front of our eyes. And even the people who are, sort of law and economic conservatives, if they practice in environmental law, they do that because they care about the environment. And, we might have a different sense of how we should use cost-benefit analysis to set, or whether we should use cost-benefit analysis to set the emissions limits. But you don't go into this field if you think there shouldn't be protection of the environment. And, I think we're at a moment where what we share is more than where we disagree, just because the entire field is in existential crisis. I mean, the administration just on Monday essentially wrote endangered species out of the Endangered Species Act. A couple months ago, they issued a blanket exemption for all offshore drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, which is not something industry was even asking for. So, the attacks are so ideological and so fundamental to the idea that we as a species need the earth to survive, that I don't think we're seeing the kind of pushback that we might have seen in another era from our more conservative colleagues who maybe think that we should focus more on the role of markets.
This is a moment of crisis, but crises are also opportunities. There's a void. People are wondering, how are we going to get up in front of a group of students and talk credibly about environmental protection or even the rule of law when we're seeing it collapse before our very eyes? What do we teach? How do we teach? We're in despair. Our students are in despair. So there's a hunger for some type of tool that can provide some guidance on what to do in a moment like this. And so I agree that I think if we had done this book 5 years ago, 4 years ago, it may not have achieved the same level of interest that it does now. When people are looking for answers, they realize that they can't teach the same way that they've been teaching for 20 years. It's a different time, and they really need to rethink how they teach.
I really appreciate the point you just made about our credibility in front of students who are seeing a very intentional destruction of everything this country claims to be in a sort of a nakedly and gleeful way. And that does, I think, call upon us to, meet that head on, um, and, provide a space for ourselves and students to really understand the moment and what it means and how we move forward. Before I shift a little bit out of the teaching guide to ask reflections on both of you on what it means to teach in this moment in different sort of geographical and other contexts. I guess I do want to invite you both, if there's anything else from the teaching guide that you want to flag that you're really excited about or you're really glad got in. I would love to invite that now, and parts of that I know and I don't miss anything that I otherwise might.
Well, I'm going to add something that I think when we wrote this book, we were thinking about faculty, right? Our primary audience is faculty. But I hope that people who listen to this podcast will ask their libraries to order a copy because I think students would love to get their hands on it. The paperback should be available in the fall, but if it's in their library, anybody can get it. Why would students like to read this book? Well, lots of reasons. First, it has a concise summary of what you need to know about a particular statute, like the Clean Air Act, or a particular regulatory tool. So it's very useful in that very basic way. But every chapter, though, presents this information in a way that's enjoyable and relatable. It's not a boring nutshell. But then finally, every chapter helps students with the question that everyone is facing right now is how has the legal system created and perpetuated systemic inequalities? And they can learn that with respect to every single topic that is covered in a foundational environmental law course. So if their professor doesn't cover it, they can raise their hand and say, excuse me, but what about? Or they can talk to fellow students, but it's an opportunity to really think about the law in a different way.
And it also is, a real move towards an experiential kind of learning, a problem-based learning that lets students draw on law to try to do what lawyers do, which is attempt to solve problems. Just to be clear, based on what Carmen said, if this book is in your library, the students do not have access to the answers to the problems. The problems are in a online companion to the book. And the answers to the problems, like how to teach them, what the answers are if they ask specific questions, are password protected and available only to professors. So you don't have to worry about your students coming in having sabotaged your class by seeing the answers.
There's always been this, I don't know, transgressive voice in my head that has just wanted to first class by giving the students the teacher's manual and just sort of reverse engineer from there.
Yeah.
All right, so we're getting close to time. So let me ask maybe a penultimate question, which is, and so you've both been gesturing to this throughout, but we are in a moment in which both state governments and the federal government is essentially trying to annihilate environmental law to the extent there is a body of law that can protect people from or promote healthy living environment. And Rebecca, I really appreciate how you put it. And, like we are a species that needs this place to live. So we have that, but we're also in a moment of deeply fascistic efforts to prevent students from gaining access to information, including about the climate emergency and just, basic historical facts and contemporary facts about race and racism. And I know that you're both in different states that approach this differently, though both, in the United States. And I would, yeah, just love to hear reflections from you both on what it means to do this work now.
I'm happy to start. And I think so much of what it means to do this work now is a function in part of where you are. So I am teaching in Chicago. I'm teaching students who, it's a very ethnically, racially diverse group of students. And in some ways, for me, this is the best time to be teaching environmental law because my students are very much aware that climate change and racial injustice, right, the bugaboos of the current administration, are getting worse. No one believes that we're post-racial. And the fact that political leaders and private actors are trying to muzzle discussion about certain topics only makes them more interesting to my students. Enrollment in my courses is increasing, not dropping. Because one of the best ways to get students interested in something is to try to ban it. Things that are forbidden are very attractive. And again, it could be a function of where I'm teaching, but it's almost like a Renaissance moment, precisely because of these attacks in different states and at the federal level.
Thanks.
So when I was teaching in New York, I was really deeply involved in some of what I think quite important things that are happening in New York City around building decarbonization. New York City, I sit on the Environmental Justice Advisory Board, and we helped the city issue a plan for environmental justice in New York City. I've been deeply involved in the Renewable Rikers movement, which is an attempt to shut the jail, not an attempt to jail, it will shut the jail. And then once the jail is shut, turn it into renewable energy generation and wastewater treatment facilities to remove that polluting infrastructure from the communities that were most impacted by mass incarceration and the unconstitutional stop and frisk policy in New York. Now, I haven't been in Louisiana long enough to say much more than it's very different. We're fighting an uphill battle, but that's part of why I moved to Tulane. I was excited by the opportunity to work with the frontline and fence line communities that have been leading this fight for decades and are still the front line of that fight. Tulane has an incredible environmental clinic that is representing community groups as they engage in that struggle, and it is the honor of my lifetime to join that fight and fight alongside them.
I'm glad they have you with them. I got to meet Kim Terrell this past January, who was formerly, at least in, I don't know if that clinic, but an environmental law clinic at Tulane, and has since left, and who's wonderful in her own right. Any concluding thoughts? Yeah, I know what we've said.
I just want to thank you. Thank you for this conversation. Thank you for this podcast. I've been binging all of the past episodes, and it's so interesting to listen to some people I know very well, many people I don't know at all, and to get to learn from them. I mean, we need more opportunities to learn from each other and to strategize together about how to build a better, fairer, safer, cleaner world, which I think we can do.
Well, and what I love about your podcast is that you have people who are experts in a wide range of areas, and yet the common thread is a very honest and focused discussions on racial justice. And sometimes those of us who teach environmental law, it's like we're placed in the margins. Like this has nothing to do with social justice. This is like some technocratic thing. So I think that by having people with expertise in a wide variety of areas, we're having a much richer interdisciplinary conversation, interdisciplinary within law, than we might otherwise have.
Well, thank you both. Real pleasure and honor to be in conversation. And I'm excited to, see how people adopt and really take advantage of this new tech. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.